Today is on global warming, and Derrick Silver has kindly offered to present us a case which I think borders on the sceptical side of global warming. Our last speaker on global warming is here tonight. It's David Dunstan, and he gave a talk saying that it was definitely going to happen, and he's kindly come along to provide a bit of criticism of Derrick. So that should liven the discussion up a bit. So with that, I may hand over to Derrick to give us a talk, if you're ready, Derrick.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I had originally written ladies and gentlemen, but there is only one. My task tonight is to talk to you about matters that concern us all. That is, the dangers that could threaten our very existence upon a global scale, and ones which some pundits claim to be very imminent indeed, requiring our immediate attention. These are dangers that could affect our well-being and even our continued existence, both on the entire human scale and the plant and animal population as well. What one may claim is the future of our world. It's certainly true that we all face two kinds of danger which threaten us throughout our lives. Those conditions that for one reason or another belong to our individual existences and which we have to face individually or at most in small individual groups. And those dangers which are unlike those just mentioned and which threaten humankind upon a global scale. Now, it's not really a new experience to awaken only to hear from one prophet of gloom or another that there are circumstances looming that are likely to endanger us all in the not too distant future. That often these dangers are due supposedly to our own fault or neglect, and had we not been careless, selfish or foolish, unheeding the warnings that have been given by one kind of expert or another, whether they be God chosen to speak in the name of fearlessly concerning man's disobedience and punishment, we should receive if we continue to turn away from what he commands, or whether they be unlike ordinary mortals, scientific cognoscenti, privileged with innate genius and a high level of education in those relevant disciplines. However, a recent, and one must say most threatening peril that has so far as I am aware never arisen in the past, nor been accompanied with so much detail, has come to light. It was two eminent scientists, Dr. George Kulka, a physicist from California University, and Robert Matthews, who was at that time head of the Geological Science Department at Brown University in Rhode Island, in January of 1972, who first warned that the Earth might well be facing a disastrous shift in its weather pattern. No one really knew what could be done to avert the threatened danger. Now, I suppose that it is obvious that these two had never lived in England, or for that matter, that they had been accustomed to unpredictable weather patterns as we are, that they appeared to have been used to. Or perhaps then our own annual climate pattern is spreading from the UK and will become a dominant feature for the rest of the world. But as far as I'm concerned, and I'm aware, no one has proposed this unlikely theory yet. However, so greatly were these two eminent scientists convinced that their conclusions were true that they wrote to the then President of the United States about their concerns for serious climate change of an order of magnitude larger than anything that had hitherto been experienced by civilized mankind. This, in spite of the fact that slow oscillations in weather and temperature have been observed over the past thousands of years. Nor were they alone in this prediction, for other scientists who voiced similar fears quickly joined them. The fears which these scientists were concerned with was, of course, not the imminent advent of global warming, not at all, but of global cooling. And the disaster that they were predicting was not global scorching, but global freezing, the advent of a new ice age. So much so was this the case that the New York Times and the Newsweek, both prestigious publications in the United States in 1975, asserted that the cooling of the world was supported by massive meteorological evidence, so much so that the scientific world was inundated with new evidence that studies were providing and was hard-pressed to keep up with it. Of course, these scientists claimed that global cooling was the beginning of which we were only just seeing, was caused by human activity. Now there's a surprise. It was because of the emission of fine dust from the burning of fossil fuels and the use of aerosols that were the primary cause of these highly dangerous climatic changes. That aerosols were a serious concern was due to the key compounds in aerosol canisters, the propellant gases, which were compounds known as chlorofluorohydrocarbons, and which were identified as a major problem in global cooling. These compounds were released every time an aerosol was used in spraying and ascended the layers of the atmosphere until they reached the layer rich in ozone, the which was damaged by them with serious results, among which was the previously observed formation of the hole in the ozone layer over Antarctica, with the resultant loss of the stability of the average pattern of weather and temperature. As far as I'm aware, there doesn't seem to be any reason why it was the small area over Antarctica that suffered damage to the ozone layer, rather than over some areas where aerosols were more likely to be used. But perhaps the penguins are to blame. However, the damage to the ozone layer has been observed and still is there, and indeed is still a concern for those who monitor its development. The whole of this problem was of sufficient concern for scientists in England to get the matter referred to a select committee in the House of Lords. The outcome of the inquiry does not appear to have resulted in any major caveat. The public, who was gradually grasping what the scientific supporters of the theory of global cooling were putting across and claiming a mighty volume of evidence in its support, were also growing in concern and demanding to be told what steps could be taken to avoid global disaster. This view continued until the early 1890s, and then dawned the 1890s. With that dawning, the pattern of the weather made another of its unpredictable about turns, and average global temperatures that had been falling changed direction and started to rise again. Perhaps the weather gods were so dismayed that humans were not trusting them any longer that they decided to show who was really in charge. In spite of this, the concept of global warming continued. However, there were one or two voices that expressed an opposing view, and as early as 1975, William S. Broecker published a paper in Science entitled Climate Change. We are on the brink of a pronounced global warming. Quite quickly, global cooling lost its popularity and its credibility, and this largely because of the weather pattern changed in a different one. This was certainly not a trivial change, but that the world was beginning to experience hot weather, such as it had not seen for a number of previous years. There can be no doubt that there were many who were keen to step on the bandwagon, and the idea of global warming received increasing support, both scientific and lay. Now, it's interesting to see that the public in general were more convinced by their current environment than scientific argument, in spite of the fact that it was only a short while ago that they had been, by the same process, believing the exact reverse. Are we likely to see them change their minds yet again? It's well known that the evidence of global warming was entirely qualitative, and in many cases mere hearsay of observations made by non-scientific persona, and much of the evidence of a more scientific nature lacked the thorough basis normally demanded by science. And what are the causes ascribed to global warming? They are greenhouse gases. Yes, you've got it, carbon dioxide again. Resulting from the burning of fossil fuels. Now, it requires a very brave and perhaps a very stupid person to believe that the burning of fossil fuels could at the same time be responsible for global warming and global freezing. However, I don't wish to express my own views on the accuracy of the concept of global warming or global freezing, although I have very strong views myself upon this subject. Rather, what I wish to do is to look at a number of matters that arise therefrom, and the first of these is that climate change is not due to outside causes beyond our control, but the supposition that it is entirely mankind's own fault. There would appear a human desire to blame the threat upon ourselves, and that being the first case, it lies within our hands to halt and even reverse the entire process, so that mankind, which created the problem in the first place, itself has averted the danger and disaster. Is this a likely supposition? Now, there's something else that is strange about the explanation that has been chosen, apart from the opposite and contradictory results of fossil fuel burning. That is, that carbon dioxide is not the only, nor even the principal greenhouse gas. For it is well reported that water vapour is the major gas responsible for heat retention upon Earth, and is known to be responsible for between 37% and 72% of the total heat from the sun retained upon the Earth. Carbon dioxide comes a poor second, responsible for only between 9% and 26%. If we're to make some sense of this, our first attention should be to dry up all the seas and oceans. But I think that this decision would be greeted with utter derision, and quite rightly so. Was it therefore that the solution would be utterly rejected and so has been quietly set on one side? By being overlooked so that more acceptable remedies could be proposed? Or have scientists been desperate for reasons unknown, determined to drive the public attention on carbon dioxide as the main culprit for the anticipated catastrophe? Now, what are the origins of carbon dioxide that is threatening us? Well, it's produced in a number of different ways. Natural ways, such as volcanoes, hot water geysers, earthquakes, major forest fires, the like. But it is the burning of fossil fuels upon which all the attention is focused. But hang on, no one ever mentions that we ourselves produce carbon dioxide, and not on a meagre scale either. Now, human respiration has been known, thoroughly researched and understood for a long time now. For we all breathe, and should that inspire anyone to correct the problem by deciding to kick the habit, it's not to be recommended, for he or she is unlikely to be around to take part in question time at the end of this talk. The composition of the air that we normally breathe is 79% nitrogen and 20.9% oxygen, both of their molecular forms N2 and O2. 0.038% carbon dioxide, methane in parts per million that are too small for me to mention, and water vapour, something like 40% of the atmosphere. In variable quantities depending upon weather and climate changes of the area, and others we're not concerned with in small quantities. But what is exhaled has the composition of 79% nitrogen, of course, 4% of carbon dioxide, and the rest water vapour, together with trace gases with which we're not concerned here. This means that the gross volume of respiration for one human being in one day is 13 number of breaths one takes per minute times 60 number of minute in a minute in an hour, 24 hours in a day, and 660 millilitres of volume per day. That gives nearly 12.5 million millilitres, 12,355,200 millilitres per day. That is 12,500 litres per day, 4.5 million litres per year. Now, the amount of carbon dioxide we exhale in these breaths is 4% less the 0.38% that we already had there before we started to breathe. So that 0.03962 times 4,509,648 litres of carbon dioxide is exhaled by each person per year. And if we assume that the ideal gas laws apply, and we apply Avogadro's law, and that the respiration temperature and pressure is normal, that is NTP, each person alive exhales nearly 351 kilograms of global warming carbon dioxide per year, per person. Now, the world population is approximately 5.5 billion this year, and is rising at an expected rate of about 1.1% per annum. So that in one year, human beings will contribute 2 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide per year. But we mustn't forget the animals. I haven't any data about them, but we could guess that when we have considered all the animals, cattle and sheep and etc., bred for one kind of food or another, and then add in the wild animals and pets, if we double the human carbon dioxide output, I would think we would not be far wrong. So then, the emission of carbon dioxide due to respiration would be nearly 4 billion metric tons per annum, and rising nearly 50 million metric tons per year. Now, it's claimed in the documentation that the total emission of carbon dioxide from burning of fossil fuels is nearly 5 billion metric tons per year, so that the global respiration accounts for almost as much as all the contribution made from fossil fuels. But this isn't even mentioned. Are we to believe that they don't know that it exists? And what should we do about it if we really believe in global warming? Die? No, there's something very fishy about the whole affair, and they put out carbon dioxide also. The conclusion we are forced to draw is that for some undisclosed reason, there is a deliberate attempt to deceive the public and to conceal vital data. Of course, whether we believe in global warming or not, the truth of the matter is that a curtailment of the production of carbon dioxide is no bad thing. But balance should govern our decisions, which should always be our own. Certainly, it's not a plan to save the planet. Incidentally, need I remind you that it's not so long ago that we're being warned about the rapidity with which fossil fuel stocks are diminishing, so that curtailment in the present wanton and unrestricted use of them could be economically and socially a good thing. Then what are we to conclude from all this? Well, I think there are 6 points I would like to make. The first, in my opinion, the most important, is the way we look at ourselves. It is our endeavour to establish and maintain our belief that human beings are the controllers of the world, its fate and its future. That we are in control of all things, and global calamities are created through our negligence and failures, and that the correction of such calamities lies within our own hands. I think this is probably not true, though in agreement with the majority of civilized persons, I would like to think it to be so. Certainly in this age, when a substantial proportion of people do not believe in God or gods, who is there left to direct the ordering of our future history if it be not ourselves? Now, it's beyond dispute that there are many major disasters and calamities that do arise which are in no way attributable to human action, as is the case in such things as the eruption of volcanoes, huge forest fires such as the one that California is suffering from now, and has done for years at this time. Flood disasters such as those in Pakistan, storm catastrophic dimensions that are calamities, which we call natural disasters. But whom do we blame for them? Well, in general, we dodge the responsibility, for we know not the answer. We concern ourselves instead with the very proper giving of aid and restoring as much of the damage as lies in our power, and even that activity cannot conceal that we had no control in the generation of the problem. This is probably one of the reasons why we take on what we call relief work at our own considerable expense. Our desperation to place ourselves in the driving seat, as it were, forces us also to invent remedy solutions. We can see that this may well be the case if in no other way than to look at the global disaster feature that we have discussed earlier. One of the really surprising things about the pundits who proposed global freezing and those who contend the opposite global burning feature both assign the same causes to explain the same remedies to cure these two opposite calamities, and both claimed that the evidence of the truth of each of their positions is irrefutable. But both can't be correct, can they? But it would seem that scientists who are forecasting permanent weather change do not find this anomaly as strange as I do. It would seem that even in spite of the growing public conviction that the theory is unsustainable, they are nevertheless continuing to publish the matter further. For on July the 28th, 2010, that's a few days ago, the Daily Telegraph reported on page 7 that following a study by Dr. Peter Scott, head of the Climate Monitoring and Attribution at the Met Office, said that the world has been heating up since the 1980s. and that greenhouse gases are the glaring obvious explanation for the 1 Fahrenheit, that's 0.56 centigrade, rise in average global warming over the past 50 years. 1 degree Fahrenheit over the past 50 years. He went on to say that despite the fact that people say global warming has stopped, the new data gives us the greatest evidence we ever have had. One wonders why. One wonders, is there so much scepticism by the public? And what and how are average temperatures calculated? It seems to me that unless irrefutable measures and procedures are to be used, one would have to tread very carefully in any acceptance of the data. The second feature that interests me is that at the end of one and beginning of the next century, there is an expectation of an apocalyptic disaster. This is even more pronounced when the end of the century marks also the end of a millennium. After all, the existence of the turns of the centuries is a result of our counting system. There's nothing special about 10, which is the basis of our counting, except of course that we have 10 fingers. What is the cause of this disconcerting approach to the entry of a new era? Is it perhaps a fear of a step in the dark, or the concern for the unknown? We know that mankind will inevitably move on to a new endeavour and discovery, and whilst these changes may not be daunting in themselves, it has to be admitted that they may reveal things we might otherwise not wish to encounter. Cries from the prophets of gloom in the past echo both in voice and in hearts, warning that the end of the world is upon us and that we should respect and repent and be saved. Does this sound a familiar note to the one we have been considering? What then is the fundamental cause of this attitude of mind? Is it perhaps the thought that even though we might be more intelligent than ever before, we no longer believe that any one genius can master all the knowledge that is needed today? The acceptance of that limitation is unwelcome, but has been largely replaced by the belief that there will be a pooling of knowledge which will make possible a collective total knowledge, which can be used as and when the need arises. I believe that this common pool of scientific knowledge may in fact work, but some scientific theories, especially those in physics, say for instance quantum mechanics, defies our understanding of nature, and we are certainly beyond the comprehension of and they are certainly beyond the comprehension of ordinary men, whatever they may be. What has been said here also applies to the arts and music, which regularly undergo mind-boggling transformations. Not least in this path of development is that desire to know how everything began, and this is evidenced by the highly expensive and possibly dangerous synchronotron experiments investigating the origins of the universe, which are currently taking place in CERN in Switzerland, with a large hadron collider, and which is endeavouring the produce of a miniature Big Bang. This huge piece of equipment is 27 kilometres in diameter and lies buried 175 metres below the surface under the Franco-Swiss border near Geneva. One might almost say we are playing at being God. The third point that I think arises from the problem of global climate change is that the problem is a classical one. It's a case of a lack of suitable system of measurement which would remove the current arbitrary choosing of data with the attendant willingness to discard phenomena which don't fit the theory being expounded. Doubtless such a need has been realised, and there must be numerous attempts to find a system based upon unbiased measurement, and which would therefore be beyond dispute. But we have not reached that goal as yet. It would seem that at the moment meteorology is still in its infancy, but we should stay open-minded until some secure ground has been found. This does not mean that speculation may never be valuable, provided that it is offered with some caution. The fourth point I wish to make arises from what I have said, that there is a deliberate attempt to turn away from what many protagonists of global warming do not wish to emphasise, such as the fact that water vapour content of the atmosphere is the major greenhouse operator and is approximately 3 times more effective in global warming than carbon dioxide. Why do our pundits not seek some procedure to limit the water vapour effect? It is perhaps that there is no visible means of progress in that direction, so that let's concentrate on something we might be able to do, even if it's only scratching the surface of the problem, than to hunt for a solution that we may not find. But this sort of thinking is biased, and biased is something with which scientific seeking for the truth must repel. The fifth point I wish to make is to bring to your attention from what I have said about the seemingly different deliberate attempt to turn away from other major sources of carbon dioxide, such as human and animal respiration, source of greenhouse gas, both carbon dioxide and methane, and to concentrate solely on the burning of fossil fuels. As I have said, I don't wish to pretend that the curtailment of the use, at least in the manner in which it is currently employed, is not a good thing. But it seems to me dishonest to conceal that other sources of greenhouse gas, or perhaps there is something even more insidious in the use of fossil fuels that the protagonists of global warming are hiding. Finally, whether we believe in global warming or not, there are many reasons for using the findings that we have been and will continue to be made during the investigations about global climate change, that it would be as well to investigate and possibly apply on a broad scale. It is also possible that the warning given some years ago forecast that fossil fuels are likely to be exhausted in the not too unforeseeable future may well encourage us to find alternatives to petrol and diesel, and for the reason that one of the principal uses of these fuels is the running of transportation, should advise us to limit their use, particularly as one of the byproducts of the use of such engines, as I have said, in the production of highly toxic nitrous oxide. It seems to me that it would be sensible to search for additional sources of energy, such as nuclear energy. It is absurd to turn our backs upon this clear source of power just because we fear that accidental disasters and because no satisfactory method of handling the toxic waste arising therefrom. Wind farms may be ugly and inefficient, but there are other sources of electrical generation which are not so lacking in efficiency. How our prudence in application of alternative sources of power, commonly known as renewable power, such as wind farms and tidal turbines, which have not up to present received as much attention, may eventually meet some of our needs. But should we not investigate what effects might arise from massive interference with the passage of weather-directed winds, or the demands made upon the derived energy from tidal methods? And might not there be some way in converting the heat generated by the sun itself into energy that is readily storable and yet readily available, in which case we would welcome the effects of global warming, would we not, if we believe in it?
Thank you very much indeed, Derek. Are there any questions or criticisms? Nick?
On my pet subjects this way. I congratulate you on your moderation in opposing. I think that global warming, anthropogenic global warming, is just another of the most appalling intellectual scams of the millennium. Western civilization, Judeo-Christian religion, has maybe largely passed away, but its forms of thought have tended to remain. And one of these is the tendency to say, oh, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, let me beat my breast, it is all my fault.
Be careful, because the breath is carbon dioxide.
And this is not, this wanting to blame yourself for everything, the post-colonial guilt, it's all our fault. I don't think, really, you see Muslims suffering from this. It's not really necessarily one of their forms of thought, or Buddhists. It's Jews and Christians and post-Jews, post-Christians in our society, particularly prone to this. And this means that otherwise intelligent, adult, middle-class, intellectual people with degrees behave like a herd of sheep that are to be scared by somebody coming along and saying, oh, look, some dreadful thing. Oh, and they will flock off in one particular direction. We can all list the things that in 1000 AD, they were told the world's about to end in an area. They went up to the mountaintop expecting the end of the world. End of the world didn't happen. And sheepishly, they came back down again and went home and didn't like to say that, oh, well, maybe you were having me over. Do we remember the Y2K disaster? Planes were to drop out of the sky. Do you remember all that? We were terrified. The clock ticked round to the appointed time, and guess what happened?
Nothing.
Absolutely jack. Right? Time and again, these rip-offs. And there are so many people who feed along the way. There are politicians who feed, industrialists who feed, administrators, authors, I'm scarce, or journalists, a headline, oh, it's all going, the world's going to end. So papers are sold. The people who feed along the way, pseudo-academics, one thing after another. Do we remember I mean, you can list them yourself: acid rain, asbestos, the global cooling, the global warming, Y2K. There's a whole long list of them. And did any of them happen? Did the skies fall? No. Time and again, what happened was the sky didn't fall. And what did people say? Did anyone stand up and say, hey folks, the sky didn't fall? Not a soul has ever said a word about it. What happens is the papers are full of the next scare. And then they're all so busy with the next scare, nobody is undiplomatic enough to mention that the previous one didn't happen. And they're just as scared the second time as they were the first time. They're just as scared the 92nd time as they were the 91st time. And they never, ever learn.
And exactly what I was trying to make a point of.
We've got this thing. Global capitalism has recently been rocked to its foundations by a scam perpetrated by Goldman Sachs, which was humbly called a giant vampire squid wrapped across the face of humanity. And they devised a financial product where they were going to sell market mortgages to indigent black people in America who could clearly not afford it. And you think, well, how can you make money like that? Well, the way you make money out of that is you sell a product that is going to fail, and you then devise another financial product that predicts the failure of the first financial product. Then the money rolls in. And they did this and world capitalism has tottered. The 20-year unstoppable growth of Chinese economy faltered because of this what's the name of this scandal?
Subprime.
So the subprime mortgage scandal. It was that titanically important thing that happened. Now, there is this thing called carbon trading. Now this is an absolutely, to me, blindingly obvious financial scam dreamt up by the financial whiz-kids at Goldman Sachs. It's got Goldman Sachs written all over it, this house, in which they say to you, come to us, give us $1,000, we will salve your conscience, and then we will pretend to plant a tree, which we will pretend will cancel out through its emission of oxygen your sins. We're selling papal indulgences here for your sins in the modern sense. And somehow, along the line, the world's leading proponent of global warming bullshit, which is Al Gore, has already pocketed multi-millions into his personal account from pushing this blatant rubbish. And it's the people who have largely been in charge of giving this a scientific, pseudo-scientific basis, have been the so-called climate research unit at the University of East Anglia, who have been absolutely mercilessly exposed by somebody publishing their emails, in which they quite explicitly say how they're making it up, and the methods by which they do it, which involve doing things like placing your weather stations in what are called urban heat islands, where it's artificially high temperature, and you don't bother with putting any in Siberia, because that would prove the world was cold. And they, you don't put them at sea. Why don't you put them at sea? No urban heat islands to produce this pseudo. And then they've even done things like take a weather station and move it. And then to compare light with light, they don't compare light with light. They actually move it nearer to the centre of the urban heat island as each year goes by. You look at it, the figures are rising, the temperature's going up. There's an awkward squad person in America, a skeptic in America apparently, who's gone around with a camera and has photographed these weather stations. He's found one of them had placed it next to a hot air vent of emissions from a building. Another one has been placed on concrete surrounded by buildings on four sides in an urban area. And then they'll come along, they'll saw the legs off, make it lower. The lower you put the weather station, the nearer the asphalt it is, the hotter it gets. And on the basis of this, they are conning millions of otherwise intelligent people into getting all worked up about it. I'm going to let somebody else.
Yes, much right. But no one else was putting their hands up. So, David?
I yield to very few people in my scepticism about government action to counter global warming and the good things which are supposed to flow from that. I don't think that there is any virtue in the steps which it is said ought to be taken to counter global warming. But I think it's very important that when the case for global warming or the case for doing things about global warming is being criticised, those criticisms should be put in careful and moderate and considered tones. And I'm a little bit concerned that there is a tendency, which I think is to be deprecated, of making criticisms that are either overblown or attribute motives that may not be there, or conceive of conspiracies that may not be there, or that are founded on facts which are incorrect. So really I think it's just a plea for moderation in our tone and our language and in the arguments that we put forward.
Have you read the emails? They're all on the internet.
Is there anyone else who wants to speak?
Well,
David?
can I follow that on? So you're a mathematician, I gather. So you are aware, of course, that mathematical controversies are not solved by digging out quotes from...
I'm sorry, I can't...
You are aware that mathematical questions aren't solved by finding out what some mathematicians said in 1980, nor by appeal to popular opinion, but rigorously by appeal to what is actually the case.
Yes, but one of the things that mathematics demands is that you have data, reliable data.
I think you might say physics relies on having data, and mathematics, I believe, is purer than that.
also mathematics.
So, just to add to the data, you commented that carbon dioxide, you commented that water vapour is some large fraction of the total global warming. Well, the true figure is about 80%. That's higher than you said. You asked why we don't reduce the amount of water vapour in the atmosphere instead of reducing the amount of carbon dioxide. The simple answer to that is the amount of water vapour in the atmosphere actually controls itself. Excess falls out as rain.
Yeah, I wasn't really being serious about controlling the water vapour. I was merely pointing out that if you want to control global warming, assuming that it's true, then you have to control water vapour, because it's responsible for the majority
80%
of the heat generated from the sun.
Now, the carbon dioxide, you quoted the correct figure for the present amount of carbon dioxide, 0.38%.
Sorry?
You quoted the correct figure for the current amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere,
Yeah.
0.38%, 380 parts per million.
Yes.
You didn't actually give us either the pre-industrial revolution amount, which was about 50% less.
Well, it's claimed that it will be rising by about 1.1% per annum.
Yes.
And I did say that.
It has been as well. This is the point. It has
Whether
been, not just
whether I haven't any data to know that whether it's true or not, but I'm assuming that if people make a statement as positive as that, then it must have some basis in fact.
Yes. It correlates to about half the amount of carbon dioxide that we are putting into the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Now, you didn't actually comment on the amount of water vapour in the atmosphere. Do you happen to know how much there is?
It varies depending upon weather conditions, as I said, and the maximum it's likely to reach is about 40%.
No. Not 40% of the atmosphere.
No.
40% of what?
Of saturation of water
Yeah.
vapour.
That's why if you get it that much further, the excess falls out as rain.
Yes.
Yes. Now, the actual amount of water vapour isn't very different from the actual amount of carbon dioxide. Are you aware
That
of that?
may well be, but I have no data on that, so I couldn't put it in.
Yes,
But-
but these are important points when you're comparing
But
the
it's
sizes of the events.
the point that I was making there, and I think you will agree with it, is that water vapour is more effective as a greenhouse gas than is carbon dioxide.
Sure.
As indeed,
That is correct.
methane is more effective than carbon dioxide, but fortunately it's there in a very small quantity.
Yes.
So, yes, about maximum of 72%. We can see what it does if you look at tornado conditions in the Caribbean and over the southern United States to see how much energy it can release. It's enormous.
Sure. And one of the things that the water vapour is responsible for is giving us the approximately 300 Kelvin, 15 centigrade average
Indeed,
global
yes.
temperature that we have. So
Yes.
we do not actually want to reduce the amount of water vapour in the atmosphere. It is responsible for giving us the climate we have been used to throughout human civilization.
Yeah, I think what ought to also be said is that, of course, the percentage of water vapour in the atmosphere varies from place to place, and it may be possible to control in some way the water vapour content where it is very high and reduce it to the sort of level that it is elsewhere. I don't know whether it's possible.
That
but
happens naturally. It's called a thunderstorm.
I know that, but I mean by human control.
Yes. You're not going to change the average amount of water vapour in
No,
the atmosphere around the world and up to
No, we don't want to do that
5%.
because we would really be facing a bad condition of
Yes.
global cooling.
Yes. Do you happen to know the temperature the Earth would drop to if we took the water
What we
vapour
want
out?
is stability,
Right. You're
not
going to-
change,
Right.
but stability.
Right. So the water vapour is responsible for the world being about 30, 40 degrees hotter than it would be otherwise.
Yes.
And we want to keep that.
Indeed
We
we
don't
do.
want to mess around with it.
Yes, indeed.
Right. Now the carbon dioxide we've added has changed the composition, the amount of carbon dioxide by 50%, from 280 to 380 parts per million. It's heading up further. It's heading towards doubling. These are very big changes. And they're almost certainly anthropogenic, because the excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is almost all free of carbon-14.
Yeah, well, I did
fossil
suggest that it helps to control fossil fuel burning. But
Yes.
we kid ourselves if we think that that's going to control the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
Slow down, I'm
Which
just
it won't.
dealing with one point at a time, if I may. So, all of the eloquence about religions making us believe we're responsible for something that we're not responsible for is actually out of order on this one, because we can directly measure the carbon dioxide, we can directly see that it comes from fossils,
I
because of its
think
carbon-14 content.
I think that measurements that are carried out up to present are highly biased. I don't think that they're trustworthy in the slightest degree.
Measurements of the isotopic composition.
Temperature.
Well, I'm talking temperature. I'm talking isotopic composition of the carbon in the atmosphere.
Oh, well, yes, and one has to wonder, and I haven't any data, one has to wonder how uniform the amount of the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere is from place to place. My guess is that it varies. Over industrial areas it'll be higher because of transport in industrial areas, because of use of industrial fuels to generate power in industrial areas.
So if I can get to my point, people can change things. It is not simply a myth deriving from Judeo-Christian religions that we can change things.
No,
we
but
can
we
change
need
them,
to know
and we
the
have changed them.
We need to know the truth,
Sure.
rather than rely on hearsay and possible falsehood.
Nick, you can come back and you come back, Nick and Dave. Nico.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on this idea that 50% increase in carbon dioxide is a significant amount. We don't know that. I mean, we don't understand the whole climate. That's the whole critique I have on this climate modeling. If you look at the IPCC report, for example, they list every factor in that is known to have an influence on the climate. But they actually admit, even in the IPCC report, that the vast majority of these factors simply are not understood at all. Now you have a very complex system like a climate, and these scientists want to make you believe that they have a formula with which they can calculate how the climate will change in the future, although most factors that are influencing the climate are not at all understood. So how is that possible? They all assume that this is a linear system, just like you did, just by saying 50% increase in carbon dioxide is significant.
I didn't say it was significant, did I?
You did significant.
I said
substantial.
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 50% is substantial.
Yeah, but the point is, we don't know what this 50% will actually do in the atmosphere. I'm not saying that it cannot happen, that global warming will actually happen, but we don't know it. And making politics, and that's the whole point. I mean, this whole global change thing is way beyond science. It is a political ideology that a lot of people use to get their paychecks at the moment. And they are all acting like we know exactly what the climate is, how the climate is working, and because we know that, we can influence it precisely by making the right politics, and that is
That's not true.
Surgical intervention.
I mean, apart from anything else, if we rely on average temperature readings, we know that the sun has an 11-year cycle for activity. It's going to affect our temperatures, that all sorts of things happen on cycles, both shorter than 11 years and both longer than 11 years as well, which conflict any just temperature measurements. What we need is some independent, unbiased, global estimation by instruments apart from human interference. so that we can tell what is happening, we can make allowances for what is natural in cycle terms, and then deduce from that, having deducted those, to what is necessary to know for global warming. Sorry, someone?
David?
Yeah, the whole global warming debate actually raises a fascinating question. I don't quite know what the answer is, and it's this. Here is an issue, parts of the resolution of which depend upon an assessment of science, and scientific data, and modelling, physics. And the interesting question is this: what role do informed lay people play in that? Because I think most of the people in this room, I can't speak for everybody, would count themselves as non-experts, as non-scientists, but as reasonably well informed. And so the question is, what, if any, role can people like us play in addressing what are, in the main, well, the arguments which have been considered so far are the scientific debates. Now, there's a whole layer of debate about global warming, which has nothing to do with science, which is an economic debate. And that's plainly an area where people like us, I think, can A, understand, and B, present and B, debate the arguments with, I think, as much skill as professionals. But I'm a bit nervous when we're dealing with the prior debate. Are the measurements of historic CO2 levels reliable? To what extent can we place faith on a particular global climate model? To what extent are the lower bound figures right? To what extent are and all the is that really a useful job for people like us at all? I mean, I just question the premise of this debate.
Yeah, well, I am also not an expert. I think what I find very difficult in this is to get the facts. Now, we've just been told that the carbon dioxide from fossil fuels has doubled in the last 150 years. Is that right? Is that what you said?
No, the quantity in the atmosphere has gone up 50%.
50%.
It was 280 before the Industrial Revolution, and 380 now.
First of all,
most of that increase
we don't
is
fossil
carbon.
that's a great figure.
C12.
If it were correct, do we actually know what the relationship exactly is between the percentage in the atmosphere and the increase in temperature? And do we know what, supposing all other factors are excluded, if there had just been this carbon dioxide increase, how much of an increase in the temperature should it have produced? And what in fact has been the increase in temperature in the last 150 years? It's gone up and down, hasn't it? I mean,
Yes.
Yes, up and down.
Yes.
Yes.
So what order? I can take all three, or perhaps you prefer to answer those questions.
It was reported to have gone up by 1 degree Fahrenheit. I find the figure is a little bit rigid. 1%. I think that's an approximation. It must be an approximation. But on what basis that they say it's gone up 1%, 1 degree Fahrenheit, I don't know, because I don't know of any satisfactory method of averaging the temperature over the surface of the world, and what the effect of that is going to be. You see, it would seem to me that they select isolated places to check the temperature. It seems to me, therefore, that it's partly human choice. Both on the entire human scale and the plant and animal population as well. What one may claim is the future of our world. It's certainly true that we all face two kinds of danger which threaten us throughout our lives. Those conditions that for one reason or another belong to our individual existences and which we have to face individually or at most in small individual groups, and those dangers which are unlike those just mentioned and which threaten humankind upon a global scale. Now, it's not really a new experience to awaken only to hear from one prophet of gloom or another that there are circumstances looming that are likely to endanger us all in the not too distant future. That often these dangers are due supposedly to our own fault or neglect, and had we not been careless, selfish or foolish, unheeding the warnings that have been given by one kind of expert or another, whether they be God chosen to speak in the name of fearlessly concerning man's disobedience and punishment, we should receive if we continue to turn away from. I've asserted that the cooling of the world was supported by massive meteorological evidence, so much so that the scientific world was inundated with new evidence that studies were providing and was hard-pressed to keep up with it. Of course, these scientists claimed that global cooling was the beginning of which we were only just seeing, was caused by human activity. Now there's a surprise. It was because of the emission of fine dusts from the burning of fossil fuels and the use of aerosols that were the primary cause of these highly dangerous climatic changes. That aerosols were a serious concern was due to the key compounds in aerosol canisters, the propellant gases, which were compounds known as chlorofluorohydrocarbons, and which were identified as a major problem in global cooling. These compounds were released every time an aerosol was used in spraying and ascended the layers of the atmosphere until they reached the layer rich in ozone, the which was what he commands, or whether they be unlike ordinary mortals, scientific cognoscenti, privileged with innate genius and a high level of education in those relevant disciplines. However, a recent, and one must say most threatening peril that has so far as I am aware never arisen in the past, nor been accompanied with so much detail, has come to light. It was two eminent scientists, Dr. George Kulka, a physicist from California University, and Robert Matthews, who was at that time head of the Geological Science Department at Brown University in Rhode Island, in January of 1972, who first warned that the Earth might well be facing a disastrous shift in its weather pattern. No one really knew what could be done to avert the threatened danger. Now, I suppose that it is obvious that these two had never lived in England, or for that matter, that they had been accustomed to unpredictable weather patterns as we are, that they appeared to have been used to. Or perhaps then our own annual climate pattern is spreading from the UK and will become dominant feature.
Today is on global warming, and Derrick Silver has kindly offered to present us a case which I think borders on the sceptical side of global warming. Our last speaker on global warming is here tonight. It's David Dunstan, and he gave a talk saying that it was definitely going to happen, and he's kindly come along to provide a bit of criticism of Derrick. So that should liven the discussion up a bit. So with that, I may hand over to Derrick to give us a talk, if you're ready, Derrick.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I had originally written ladies and gentlemen, but there is only one. My task tonight is to talk to you about matters that concern us all. That is, the dangers that could threaten our very existence upon a global scale, and ones which some pundits claim to be very imminent indeed, requiring our immediate attention. These are dangers that could affect our well-being and even our continued existence for the rest of the world. But as far as I'm concerned, and I'm aware, no one has proposed this unlikely theory yet. However, so greatly were these two eminent scientists convinced that their conclusions were true that they wrote to the then President of the United States about their concerns for serious climate change of an order of magnitude larger than anything that had hitherto been experienced by civilized mankind. This, in spite of the fact that slow oscillations in weather and temperature have been observed over the past thousands of years. Nor were they alone in this prediction, for other scientists who voiced similar fears quickly joined them. The fears which these scientists were concerned with was, of course, not the imminent advent of global warming, not at all, but of global cooling. And the disaster that they were predicting was not global scorching, but global freezing, the advent of a new ice age. So much so was this the case that the New York Times and the Newsweek, both prestigious publications in the United States in 1975,